I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that stuff. I can't. There's good friends of mine out of the fucking state. Well, he could vote, you have to do it first.
That's why I said to you before, you don't understand, doesn't it? It comes to me that the boss is your boss. Understand?
I'm not move for toys or games or kidding, right? I'm not move for plans, I'm not move for games, I'm not move for none of that stuff there. This is going to be a prison monster till I die. Be an hour from now, be it tonight, or 100 years from now, I'm in jail. You're going to be out of
You ain't supposed to be alive. Because I was making an example out of you for any motherfucker that planted on me again. You understand? So the only reason you're still alive, don't think because we stopped. It was because that woman walked in the door. Then you would have been gone. You weren't supposed to walk away no more. You me, and that was the worst thing you ever did.
Point, we are going to get into another segment of the Rat Files, which we'll probably do next week and the week after. We are not going to get to Philly this week, so I apologize to everybody. We will get to that next week. I just want to, just for the sake of my headaches of rendering everything, we're going to really try to keep these podcasts to an hour and a half, 2 hours max, just because we're doing the visual stuff. So we are going to get into the Rat Files. And so last week, we talked about Frank Lefty Rosenthal, Rocco Scaffidi, and Harry Riccobene. And we got a lot of emails from all of you about the shock that Harry Riccobene talked. And the reality is, he did, as well as the other two we just mentioned. Now, a lot of people get this entire thing confused, okay? A rat is anybody who gives up anything about anybody, okay? If you listened to our live the other night, you heard me and Tom LaVecchia debate. And it was a good debate. So go back to our last live and look at me and Tom talk about this discussion or this topic. And we debated whether there was a hierarchy to ratting. And to me, there's not. You either are or you aren't. A rat is a rat is a rat. You know, and so I was really the first person on the scene to call Michael Franzese a rat before anybody else. I was the first to tell you that Harry Riccobene was a rat. And I've been the only one that's told you that Joe Bonanno and his son Bill were rats. And for some odd reason, a lot of people refuse to believe it. Even when over the years I've posted page after page after page after page of documents proving it. There is some validity in what that other bosses drop dimes to control the flow of the action on the streets. And that doesn't make them worse or better than Joe Bonanno at all. It makes them really, at the end of the day, the same exact fucking thing. Is there a difference between what Joe Bonanno said versus others? Yes, absolutely. But does that mean person A is worse than person B? No, it's the same action, but person A who gives up more information or hurts or damages more people just glows a little more brightly red than other people. You know, so today we're going to talk about Joe Bonanno, Bill Bonanno, who ran to the feds. The same way that Harry Riccobene went. Bill Bonanno went the same way. Joe Bonanno went the same way. And with everything we do, there's a reason in the background. And so the background that we need to regurgitate begins with Joe Bonanno attempted to hit the commission, which included Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and Frank DeSimone. Bonanno had always felt handicapped by friendships. In the powerhouse of Genovese, Lucchese, and Gambino left the Bonanno family, neutered for the most part. When it would come to commission votes, Bonanno knew he was always going to be bullied and outvoted. And this issue with Joe Bonanno goes back almost to the day that he took over his own crime family in the 1930s. Joe Bonanno from day one was a thorn in the side of the Mafia, and especially other mob bosses. And when Lucky Luciano was plotting the demise of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, it was Bonanno who played both sides of that fence, irritating Luciano to no end. In fact, in a few instances, suggestions were made to kill Joe Bonanno early on, but Luciano refused. Why he refused likely was because he needed to use Bonano against other people. I don't know Lucky Luciano. I never met him. I'm not John Panisi, and I'm not going to tell you his ghost came into my fucking house and gave me the reasons. All right? But Luciano knew what a fucking snake Joe Bonano was. And sometimes it's better to leave the snake in the garden to kill the rats than to deal with the problem later on down the line. And the reality is that Bonano did Luciano a huge favor. Because like I said, he played both sides against one another. He ran to Masseria telling him not to trust Luciano, and that Luciano was planning some sort of coup against him. But Luciano ends up beating Masseria to the punch. And it's also been said that Joe Bonano wanted the entire mafia for himself in those early days. And a lot of the problems for Luciano aligning with everybody was that Joe Bonano would not get on board. He wouldn't make a decision, but finally, as history tells us, he does. Luciano whacks Maranzano and then slowly begins to reform the mafia. Now, why on earth he gave Joe Bonano a stake in the commission is beyond my understanding. But I do think it had a lot to do with Canada, narcotics trafficking, and booze coming out of Canada. I think ultimately it was a money decision, whether Luciano liked it or not. Bonano was an integral part to the operations of the mafia. He had contacts other people needed. Maybe Luciano thought if Bonano got what he wanted, he might just shut the fuck up and be happy. But Luciano would be wrong about that. So as we know, Joe Bonano tries to move on the commission. Joe Magliocco, who wanted to be recognized by the commission, was upset about that. And Bonano used him in the sense that he needed somebody he could trust. And he put things into motion and likely played on Magliocco's frustration and anger. And Magliocco was probably likely promised to be the Bonano's number two, because it's my belief that Joe Bonano didn't want a commission and that Bonano was going to attempt to restructure the entirety of the mafia and name himself boss of bosses. I don't think he could have carried it out, but his goal was to merge and take it all over for himself. And it would never be, because Magliocco hands the list of hits to Joe Colombo, who is said to have been a proficient hitman, but there's no files to prove that he was ever prolific at anything. Joe Colombo, sensing that this could be trouble, runs to Gambino and Lucchese and tells them. We can argue whether he could have pulled it off or not, but I don't think that would have ended well for Colombo, and I think he truly saw that Joe Bonano was using him, and Magliocco too, and that he would be sacrificed to appease the others who were going to be angry. So when Carlo finds out, he summons Magliocco and Joe Bonano to a meeting over it. Bonano flees out of the country and hides in Montreal, scared out of his fucking mind, only creating friction between the Catronis and the New York Commission. Magliocco, for his part, as we know, admitted to his own role, refusing to name Joe Bonano as a co-conspirator. So here's Magliocco standing in front of the commission, knowing he could be killed. He refuses to fucking out Joe Bonano. Stand up. But the commission knows better, because Magliocco didn't have the brains or the powers that Joe Bonano had. So they sanction and toss Magliocco out on his ass, and they let him live. They sent many guys to Montreal to speak to Joe Bonano, including Sam the plumber, DeCavalcante, and others. And Bonano tells Sam DeCavalcante more or less to tell Gambino to go fuck himself. And he doesn't acknowledge or take orders from any commission. And that's an easy thing to say when you're protected in Montreal. 5 times the commission asked Joe Bonano to come back to New York and settle it. And I think, and listen, I don't know this for a fact, but I think Gambino somewhat respected how Joe Bonano felt about the situation. I think he got it on a visceral level. But at the same time, Gambino and Lucchese continued to ask Bonano to come back. And the fact is, he refused. And he led them to believe that he had been and that leads them to believe that he's the mastermind of the whole thing. Magliocco was a man. He owns up to it. He took his lumps like a fucking man. And under questioning, refused to out Joe Bonano. So with Joe Bonano hiding out, Bill Bonanno, the bumbling son, takes over the crime family. Bill was the consigliere of the family at the time, and he ends up assuming control by nepotism. His promotion infuriates the family as Bonanno got the position, like I just said, without acumen or willingness. It was just nepotism. Bonano wasn't a street guy. He didn't even grow up in New York City. He was raised in Arizona in a private school. What the fuck did he know about the streets? As Bonano sits in the chair, Gaspari de Gregorio, who had been the logical next in line, forms his own splinter cell of the Bonano crime family, which we saw today. Tory Bonano tried to defend by saying, well, they defected, so we did the right thing, we ratted. The crew, which was led by Gaspari, was supported not just by the commission, but also by Stefano Magaddino. And Magaddino had an ongoing turf fight with Bonano in Canada, and the commission knew that the instability created by a boss hiding and his bumbling son attempting to ride the waves was a horrible idea. Magaddino and the commission also felt that Joe Bonano would not leave his son in the lurch, and that maybe it was a way to get Joe out of hiding. Like, you're going to leave your kid in charge, all hell's getting ready to break loose. Maybe they thought he would come back. What man would throw his son to the wolves like that? And the answer is simple. Joe just basically threw his son to the wolves. Good luck. Magaddino backing Gaspari, and then the commission was a message to Joe Bonano that his days were done. And as we know, the Bonano Wars would begin, and eventually the commission throws out both Joe and Bill Bonanno from the Mafia. They were both thrown out of the mob. Both were expelled and told not to get involved in any more Cosa Nostra business again, and if they did, they were going to be killed. Some have said, and I've never said this publicly because I can't prove it, but some people have said that Gambino put a murder contract on both of them. But I don't believe that to be the case, because if there had been, they would have been killed without hesitation. But there's been talk that there was, or at least it was discussed. Even after all of that, Joe and Bill Bonanno refused to go away. And the choice for the family was simple. Either back Joe and Bill or risk being killed. And if you sat on the fence, you were going to be killed by either side. And Bonanno essentially splits his family into two sides. And it was bad for business. But like I said, Joe did this shit while he was in hiding. And he throws his son to the wolves, who was inept in every single way and couldn't carry himself, let alone a crime family. In 1964 is when all of this ratting begins. October 21st of 1964, after Bonanno splits his family into shambles and after the Mafia kicks them both out, Joe Bonanno allegedly gets kidnapped in New York City and is not seen again for 19 months. And the kidnapping never happened the way that Bill Bonanno claims, or Joe, because it was staged for Bonanno to avoid a Senate hearing and also set the stage for what I believe was a plan for Bill Bonanno to begin telling on everybody else and ratting. If Joe wasn't going to be given what he wanted, he would, by proxy, find a way to get it done. And Joe actually takes off to Montreal and then moves back and forth from Arizona, California, Italy, and Canada, and then he hides in upstate New York at a cabin. And there were two reasons for this. Number one, the Bonannos wanted to facilitate him. They knew that the FBI would want to find Bonanno, and they wanted to frame Magaddino with the kidnapping because he was the thorn in their side. And it was Bonanno's plan to stage the kidnapping in a plot to overthrow the Mafia by giving up information. And that coincides directly with the first memo of an informant in the Bonanno crime family. And we know that to be the one and only Bill Bonanno. And even for those who claim that it never happened, you have to ask yourself first and foremost, how the feds had such great intel about the Bonanno Wars. 64 through 68, the feds would learn so much, just not about the Bonanno crime family, but the warring factions and other bosses in New York City. The FBI were told where to place bugs and hangouts where Gaspar de Gregorio was and other mob families. Who else would know that information? Nothing was ever mentioned in the intel about where to place the bugs on Bill Bonanno, but seemingly the FBI knew where to go against others who were against the Bonannos. The FBI had a list of those who were loyal to Joe Bonanno and those who weren't. Those who were against Joe and Bill were fed crimes, were basically fed intel about them and their crimes, and those men, their locations, their relationships, and more. All of this intel shows up on FBI reports, which we've posted on our YouTube community page. While the name on these files can be redacted in many senses, we know it to be Bill Bonanno because eventually it would come to light. And as I said, when you trace the informant number and you cross-reference with other FBI index numbers and you cross-reference with other FBI reports, it makes it very clear. And it doesn't take a leap to figure out who that was. Then there were the memorandums from Altoona Prison and other jails where the FBI was there to see Bill Bonanno. So for anybody to say that it isn't Bonanno, doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about. And if you look at the screen, and I read this verbatim, what other mob guy has a problem with his father getting kidnapped? Name me one other person who had this problem. So don't tell me that it's not Bill Bonanno. We know it is. Tory Bonanno even admits they ran to the feds. So for anybody saying this is nonsense, obviously you're wrong. A report from June of 1967 describes in great detail the FBI's attempt to use old case agent named S.A. Anderson to revive his friendship with informant Bill Bonanno. Like the informant, Bonanno has to deal with a personal problem involving his father after Joe Bonanno was kidnapped, and he was left to lead a crime family against anti-Bonanno forces. He was a sitting duck with a murder contract on his head. Men that Bill Bonanno would have naturally turned to for help in the past, like Joe Magaddino or Stefano Magaddino, were all dead or had turned against them. And this probably created an incredible amount of angst inside of Bill Bonanno. Special Agent Richard Anderson likely exploited that vulnerability to gain his confidence and develop him as an informant, which is what he did. So according to the report, Bonanno was an enthusiastic and valuable source, at least early on. Bonanno's problem was partially resolved when Joe Bonanno reappeared suddenly and resumed control of the family, which we know didn't happen. And this is probably when the informant stopped giving as much information at a high level that he had done in the past, because according to FBI reports, he became difficult to handle. And it would only seem natural, I guess, that Bill Bonanno would be less inclined to talk, given that his father's absence caused him to cooperate in the first place, which is nonsense. That's just the FBI sort of putting a nice rainbow around it. And Bill Bonanno had his problems. He couldn't outlast his enemies, and the commission was against him and his father. And he turns really to the only help he could, ratting. Just when Joe Bonanno began ratting, I suspect, was much earlier on than we know, but the first provable instance of this is in August of 1967, but I believe it to be a little earlier. And that memo was information that only Bill Bonanno would have had. And we posted that memo over to our YouTube community page, so you can go check that out there. In addition to that memo, Bonanno identified Paul Siaka and Paul Crociata and Frank Mari as members of a rival faction of Joe Bonanno. The memo also details the meeting between Bill Bonanno and those men. By that time, Gaspari DeGregorio had been asked to step down. Bonanno was able to provide agents about all mob families, and he did. He spoke at length about Tommy Lucchese's entire past, all his crimes, and he tips the feds off as to who was taking over that family because Tommy had just passed away. So don't tell me he didn't give no information other than his enemies, you prick. A few months after Bill Bonanno was persuaded to resume cooperating with the FBI, 3 members of the anti-Bonanno opposition were machine-gunned to death in the most violent episode of the entire Bonanno War. The FBI's stated objective when recontacting Bill Bonanno in 1967 was to instill in him the proper perspective and lay the groundwork for accelerated activity on his part in the interest of the FBI. They wanted Bill Bonanno to rise to the head of his family and perhaps eventually gain a seat on the commission. So there you go. That's really the truth about why they're doing this. Bill and Joe are using the FBI to get what they fucking want. Bill and Joe Bonanno had lost their rank and file support. So did the FBI actively encourage Bonanno to continue to fight beyond his intended limits? Absolutely. Keep shooting, keep shooting, keep shooting. And this is why Bill and Joe refused to back down, because they had FBI support. Bonanno would also explain to agents the problems within the Colombo crime family. It's through Joe Bonanno that we know that the FBI knows how everything went down with Joe Colombo. How do you think we know this? We know this because it came from Bill and Joe Bonanno. He explained that Colombo was backing Paul Siaka, and because Colombo knew the commission could control Siaka, Colombo had designs about taking over turf control by the Bonannos in Brooklyn. But I kind of have a hard time believing that because Colombo had his own share of bullshit going on. And I think this is Bonano placating the feds to go after Colombo for the disrespect about running back and telling Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino what was going to happen. The FBI would note that the information that Bonano was providing was high up intel and that regular members on the street would not have access to any of this kind of information. Bonano would tell agents that during a recent trip he made alone to Europe to visit his mistress, he was able to reveal the exact length of the trip, the itinerary, the full name of the mistress, and what they did together. And as I said, I believe Bonano was talking prior to 67. And I think it's closer to 61 and 62. But the first time it's actually mentioned is 64. The FBI report produced in September of that year explained that the feds wanted to arrange some private interviews with Bill and Joe Bonanno in an attempt to get them to cooperate. And according to that memo, Bill Bonanno agreed to cooperate fully on that day along with Joe. However, Bill didn't manage to really start giving them a ton of shit until October 21st of 64. And as we said, this is designed specifically after his father gets kidnapped. Well, the fake kidnapping. And it's just for optics. Nothing more, nothing less. What also proves that Bonanno was a rat is that in his silly fairy tale book, he describes fleeing New York City for 2 weeks after his father was kidnapped for his own safety, and allegedly he hid out with Bonanno mobsters. However, that's a huge fucking lie. We know that because Bonanno was actually in Canada to meet with his father and FBI agents. We know this because there's an FBI memo from December 23rd of 64, just a month after Joe disappears. We also know this because of the Catronis files that Bonanno was hiding out in Montreal at the time. Bill was there to consult with his father, but took meetings in a hotel with unnamed men, which I believe to be agents of the FBI, because after this memo, the FBI stopped looking for Joe Bonanno, suddenly. And as we said earlier, the premise was to use his father's kidnapping as a reason to be seen meeting with agents. But in fact, he was meeting with agents and with his father to drop information on their enemies. Rumors began to spin in the streets that Bonanno was not kidnapped, but really was actually being hidden away because he was giving up information. That's a lot of the reason why I think Gambino never moved on him. And I think a lot of guys suspected this specifically because Bonanno suddenly reappears in New York City. And the FBI worked complicit with the NYPD to arrest Bonanno immediately to make it look right optic-wise. So who do you think arrested Joe Bonanno? Special Agent Anderson. There you go. That's what proves that it was an optic move. Bill would give up everybody and their mother. And we don't know when he specifically stopped either. Many claim that it ended in 68. But I know that not to be the case because when Bill would take a pinch some years later, as the Bonannos were attempting to gain a foothold in California, he was met in a cell and continued to engage in ratting. Further memos of Bill Bonanno's cooperation in an interview that took place in a jail in Tucson, Arizona. On the early morning of January 1st of 1965, Bonanno had arrived in Tucson, his hometown, a few days earlier after hiding out in New York and New England for 2 months. He was promptly arrested as a material witness into his father's kidnapping. He spent 2 days in a prison cell where he secretly agreed to be interviewed by the FBI. That interview took place over 5.5 hours, and so much of what Bill Bonanno likely revealed is not included in these excerpts. The report was produced by the FBI's New York office, which suggests that agents from there traveled to Tucson to conduct the interview. Who do you think was the guy that went there to conduct that interview? Special Agent Richard Anderson. What a shock. If we assume, that Anderson travels to Tucson to conduct that interview, which we know he did, it raises a lot of suspicion that Bonanno had already explored the possibility of ratting prior to that. Otherwise, why talk to Anderson when Bonanno could have easily lied to the local agent who arrested him, who he knew quite well? Did Bonanno ask for Anderson? He was sent because Bonanno fell under the purview of the New York office. Did Bonanno crack only after one night in jail? No, he immediately started talking. So Bill Bonanno's statements about his father's kidnapping were, pretty consistent actually with what he wrote in his memoirs. Bill Bonanno told agents he had no prior knowledge of his father's kidnapping, but put the blame on a rebel group. He added that he didn't know the fate of his father. And he said his father's soft heart was his undoing. That's the reason why he's ratting. Instead of crushing the rebel group at the first sign of trouble, Joe Bonanno insisted that his son settle his differences without bloodshed and go to the feds. That's exactly what he tells these people in a jail. And so there's FBI teletypes. And, you know, it's the subject is La Cosa Nostra, Arizona conspiracy. As the Bureau is aware, the NYO expended a considerable effort to develop Bill Bonanno, a live member source in the Bonanno crime family of Cosa Nostra. During the early part of his development, he furnished information of considerable value to the Bureau. During this time, the informant had a personal problem involving his father, which was capitalized on his development, which resulted in Special Agent Anderson being able to develop an insanely close relationship with him and his father. S.A. Anderson, playing on this problem in a sympathetic manner, was able to completely gain the confidence of this La Cosa Nostra member who is extremely suspicious of all law enforcement officers. Following the partial resolution of this relative's problem, the transfer of S.A. Anderson to Minneapolis, the informant has been difficult to handle. In other words, he didn't want to talk to anybody but S.A. Anderson. As the Bureau is aware, the informant's family is and has been some time in a state of influx. The New York office feels that at time it is appropriate to capitalize on this state of flux in which the informant may lose his standing within the family. So this is them saying, let's back him now. Let's back him. We'll get rid of everybody else and we'll back him. And that's really what they're saying. It is felt the same approach which was initially made should be repeated in an effort to reconfirm the informant in the Bureau's service. New York, 92-2300. Special Agent Anderson is the only agent whom the informant will talk to and trust. And this is the only special agent that has been able to get information to develop a full rapport with this individual. In order for the optimum effectiveness to be made by the New York office, it is felt that the Bureau should make use of Special Agent Anderson they should use Special Agent Anderson's personal relationships with the informant and his father. If the effectiveness of this source can be reinforced by the contact of Special Agent Anderson, given the proper direction thereafter, it is felt that he has the potential to rise to the head of it's felt this part kills me. It's felt that he has the potential to rise to the head of his family and perhaps gain a seat on the commission. The New York office strongly requests that Special Agent Anderson be authorized to come to New York, to whom this contact with the informant, which it is hoped, will lay the groundwork for accelerated activity on his part in the interest of the Bureau. If this can be accomplished, the informant has the definite potential of penetrating the Mafia at an extremely high level. It is anticipated that Special Agent Anderson would remain in New York for 1 week and not to exceed 2 weeks, depending on the difficulties of contact with our source and the amount of time that's necessary to give him the proper instructions on how to achieve this. 1/14/1965. This comes out of Legat, Ottawa. From the FBI director, FBI La Cosa Nostra conspiracy enclosed for Legat, Ottawa is a copy of a New York letter to the Bureau, 12/23/1964, captioned Bill Bonanno, Joe Bonanno, top echelon criminal informant program. Enclosed letter details a trip with New York that Bill Bonanno, where he was in touch with individuals operating as a part of or associated with members of Cosa Nostra. Information has been developed from a number of highly confidential sources, which include Joe Bonanno and Bill Bonanno, in positions to report on high-level Cosa Nostra activity, where there is a membership group of the Mafia in Montreal, which over the years has operated as a part of the New York family, headed by commission member Joseph Bonano. Teletype, Urgent 2, Director FBI, 92-1625, and SACS Buffalo to Phoenix, 92-534. From New York, Unsubs 2, Joe Bonanno, Victim Obstruction of Justice, Conspiracy. Salvatore Vincent Bonanno, also known as Bill, son of the victim, was interviewed by Pima County jail officials, Tucson, Arizona, by Special Agent Anderson from approximately 12:50 a.m. until 5 o'clock in the morning, December 31, 1964. Alleged kidnapping of Joe Bonanno, October 21, 64. Bonanno stated the kidnapping of his father was well calculated in a planned job pulled off by Stefano Magadino and 3 other individuals from a rebel group within his father's family. Bonano advises that he does not know the fate of his father, and at this time, nor does he know his whereabouts. He stated that he knew that meetings were to be held on Monday and Tuesday, at which time the fate and the rest of the family would be resolved. And that is to say, if they could again operate freely on the streets without fear of reprisal from other families. Bonano stated, "Why do you bother us? We're nobody now." Bill advised that group remaining with his father has a spokesman for them who is attempting to arbitrate the situation. When queried about the spokesman, he stated, "You know who it is. Does the name Joe Notaro ring a bell to you?" And then he smiled, indicating that this was the person that Bonano had advised when the situation was resolved and agreements are reached. Then he says Gaspare de Gregorio is going to come out heavy. He's going to bring out guns. And what this appears to be is Bonano is basically just telling him everything. And then Bonano doubles down and he says, "I don't really like de Gregorio, but he knows what's going on. He never leaves. That's the guy you need to watch." Then they queried Bonano on the organization itself. And Bill stated for the first time that my father has been the boss of Cosa Nostra since 1930. I cannot remember the exact date. September 19th, 1930, he explained to them, was after the death of Salvatore Maranzano, who was a boss prior to Joe Bonanno's taking over. Bill would go on to say, "It must have been around that time then, I think." Bill stated, "Now I guess you will make another Valachi out of me." Bonano stated that his father had been 15. He had between 15 and 20 captains in the crime family until his recent trouble with the commission would name every single member and crimes that they were involved in. And at that time, it says it was felt best not to press Bill Bonanno anymore at this particular time because he was giving shit up. Bonanno would give intel on Vic Catroni. Now, remember when we did that series, we said that somebody was 100% tipping off the Canadian authorities on people. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. Bonanno, remember when we did the Canadian series, we said that someone was 100% tipping off Canadian law enforcement, right? And it's not long after Catroni explains to Joe Bonanno, you got to leave Canada because he's causing headaches for everybody. And suddenly Catroni begins to have problems with law enforcement, right? And it's always been my belief that even after Bonanno sent Galante to Canada, Catroni helped facilitate the authorities finding out about Galante and his deeds. So I can't prove that, but there's enough going on to suggest that somebody got in somebody's ear. But Catroni wanted Bonanno the fuck out of Canada. He wanted all Bonanno representation out of Canada, but we're never going to know. Bonanno would go on to name Angelo Bruno and other mob bosses who were in control of their families, their hierarchies, in every single state that was represented by the Mafia. And in the end, the FBI used that information to corroborate a ton of shit. So there's no telling how many men might have gone to prison for what Joe Bonanno and Bill Bonanno told them. Joe and Bill Bonanno had no way to get around the commission, and the end result was providing the FBI with information so that they could get the heads of the commission arrested or murdered to take over. Joe and Bill Bonanno believed, even into the 1980s, that they could take over the entire Mafia again. And it was truly the last card that Bonanno had in his tricks, and it failed. And in sort of finality, Joe and Bill Bonanno never had the makings of a varsity athlete. But they didn't just stop there. When they were trying to muscle in San Jose and they were shaking down car dealerships, Bill Bonanno got arrested again. And in prison, when he got arrested for that, he started squealing on everybody again, giving information about the Dragnas, giving information about anything that they could. And so I want to close it out by saying they were informants. They gave up information. Irrefutable. And there will be many of you, and rightfully so. And I will agree with this statement to some extent. Well, that was the time period. A lot of guys were, in fact, in many different ways, dropping dimes on each other. You're right. Doesn't make it right. And I'm not saying that one is higher or lower than the next. But the reality is to sit there and say, well, they only informed on their enemies, so it doesn't count. No, it does count. It does count. And if you've ever read Joe Bonanno's book, it's very interesting. There's a lot of mistruths. But if you read that book, it's all about him and about how the mafia was supposed to be this and that. But this is a guy who never played by the rules. This is a guy from the 1930s wanted to take over everything. And he thought the only way that he could accomplish that by murdering everybody to get to the top, which is a gangster thing to do, don't get me wrong. But they never stopped giving intel. And for anybody that says, well, you know, everybody else, no, they did it because the only way that Joe Bonanno could ever get back into the mafia, the only way he could ever do it is by getting everybody arrested. And this guy actually believed that allowing the FBI to help them achieve that the FBI would leave them alone. Which brings up a bigger conspiracy theory and a bigger conspiracy thought. If the FBI could have gotten this done and they put Joe Bonanno on the commission and he forms one universal mafia, which is what he wanted to do. He didn't want 5 families. He wanted to be the boss of everything. No more 5 families. I'm the boss of everything. Could you imagine how many fucking people, if he was able to accomplish that with the FBI's help, can you fucking imagine the amount of people he would have put in prison? Thousands. And as it stands today, we don't know how many people that Joe and Bill put in prison. And that's not all. I could have done this show and shown you 3,000 pages of paperwork of information they gave up. But at that point, it becomes like ad nauseum. You know what I mean? So there you have it. They were informants. It is what it is. And so listen, guys, I know this is a shorter show than you guys are used to, and I appreciate it, but it's going to be so much easier uploading this. So next week when we come back, we're going to do another segment of Rat Files. We're going to do another Q&A. We are going to get to the Philadelphia mob war, and that'll probably be over an hour and 10 minutes of material on its own. And we'll wrap up the Philly mob wars. And it brings up an invariable question. You know, how much more can you really say about Philly? Really, you can't. I don't have much more to say about it after that. But it's an interesting look at street politics in action. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the show. I hope that you're enjoying, well, I don't think anybody's enjoying seeing my fucking face. But I wanted to thank all of you. And don't forget Sunday.